Well, good evening, everyone. It gives me the very greatest pleasure, on behalf of the Courtauld, to welcome you all to this book launch this evening. My name is Kyle Leyden, and I am the lecturer in early modern architecture and visual culture here at the Courtauld, with a particular interest, needless to say, in the history of the Strand. Obviously, the Courtauld's spiritual home. We're currently up here in Vernon Square, but our home down on the Strand at Somerset House is about to undergo a major renovation, and we should hopefully be moving back there within the next few years, which we're all very much looking forward to. So it's a very pertinent place, as I said, to launch what is actually the first book to undertake the unimaginably titanic task of systematically documenting the torrent of life that has, for in excess of a millennium, rolled up and down the cobbles of the Strand, one of Europe's greatest thoroughfares. Few books can possibly have the unabashed ambition, I think, to commence their story a few million years in the past and finish with a flourish in an imagined post-apocalyptic future foretold in 1863 by the novelist Samuel Butler, where thinking machines, broken free from the shackles of non-sentience, saunter along the Strand in fashionable garb, whilst humankind, poor old humankind, has been relegated to a service class hidden from view in a subterranean purgatory. Samuel Johnson famously declared that there is in London all that life can afford, and at its very epicenter lies this vital artery, bringing lifeblood not just to the heart of the City of London, but also exerting political, commercial, artistic and cultural power around the globe. The Strand is a street that has indeed played host to all that life can afford. Market traders, high church clerics, of the pre-Reformation church, politically influential aristocrats, artists, musicians, industrialists, printmakers, scientists, prostitutes, and the odd groundbreaking sexologist and Courtauld student, all have called the Strand home over the past 1,000 years. From Roman road to ecclesiastical enclave to centre of commerce and law, from a cultural and political centre of power to, in what can only be described in more recent times, as a post-war descent into what Eileen has colourfully called a plunge into abyss of mediocrity, this book traces the history of what is really described as perhaps the finest street in Europe. It is a history peppered with a parade of personalities, charting the changing physical appearance of the Strand alongside vignettes of some of those who populated it in various ages. This is indeed the very first book to attempt to tell the full story of the Strand and to begin to consider how the thoroughfare can be reinvigorated and indeed reborn in the future, commencing with the recent architectural and infrastructural interventions that have taken place there. Tonight we celebrate the publication of this most welcome and ambitious text by bringing together some of the leading thinkers and writers on the Strand, who will bring us on a fascinating journey, just like those dandy flaneurs of old, down the history of this great street and into a discussion of what it holds in its future. On the one side of this discussion, Dr. Manola Gwertshi of the University of Kent is an expert on the great panoply of aristocratic town palaces which graced the Strand in the wake of the Reformation, whilst the Reverend Dr. Peter Babington is the current priest in charge of the Church of St Mary le Strand, charged with the challenge and perhaps the poisoned chalice of overseeing the restoration and reinvigoration of the church, truly the architectural jewel in the Strand, as part of a project which has seen the eastern portion of the Strand transformed from busy thoroughfare, clogged with London traffic, into an urban park centred on the area around Somerset House. After hearing these two perspectives on the past and the future of the Strand, we will then convene a roundtable discussion with the authors Geoff Browell and Eileen Chanin, and we will have an informal talk about the content of the book and its purpose. Then we'll have the opportunity for questions for all the speakers before we retire for a well-earned drink at a reception in the common room, where copies of the book, of course, will be available for sale, and where we can continue to discuss this fascinating street and Like Noel Coward looking down on the development of the Old Witch in King's Life and the windows of the Old Witch Theatre, ask ourselves, what has become of London? The higher the buildings, the lower the morals. But on that note, I will introduce the first of our speakers this evening, who, as I said, is going to take us on a trip back into the past, I think, of the Strand and talk something of the aristocratic palaces, which basically populated the street in the immediate wake of the Reformation. Manolo Guerci's education, professional and academic experience and expertise covers architecture, art and architectural history, as well as heritage and conservation, and he developed his expertise between Italy, France and Britain. Between 2005 and 2010, he taught in the departments of art history and architecture at Cambridge before joining the Kent School of Architecture and Planning. His research interests range from the early modern period, his primary field of research, to modernism. His work centres around how one brings the concept of precedent to the practice of design and to an understanding of space cultures and cultural sustainability more broadly. Current projects that Manolo are undertaking include a new online open access critical edition of the Book of Architecture of John Thorpe, preserved in Sir John Soane's Museum in London, and he has published widely his books including, of course, London's Golden Mile, Great Houses of the Strand 1550 to 1650, published in 2021, and this is considered to be the seminal work on the early modern town palaces of the Strand. So, without further ado, I shall pass you over to Manolo.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Kyle, for your kind introduction. So what I'd like to do in introducing this book this afternoon is to reflect on the various aspects which have shaped the Strand historically, from what one might call the beginnings, but also how it has changed the way I understood a number of key aspects, especially insofar as my own journey towards the Strand was concerned. This is a mixture of about this book. Well, we can do with a little music. That's all right. Don't worry. That was not bad. It was not bad. Yeah, just push the side, perhaps.
Throw it out the window.
No, the side.
There you go, you've got it.
Okay. So, really, what I want to do is to think about how the various aspects that shaped the Strand historically, but also, as I was saying, how this has changed my own understanding when it comes to my own journey towards it. Really, this is a mixture of about this book as well as about me and the book, if you forgive me for that, which I hope will highlight what this biography can do to the reader, as it were. As someone who spent a considerable part of his life thinking about Strand, and for me the word means the great houses, 11 palaces which one were and indeed made the Strand. So the Strand for me means the early modern period, which in reality means from the late Middle Ages, when the so-called bishops' inns, here you see the cover of my book, and here you see a very early view, which shows one of the bishops' inns, Durham House, somewhere in the middle of Strand, as it were. So when those bishops' inns started to populate the area, until going all the way towards the 19th century and the end of it, when the last of these palaces that substituted the inns disappeared altogether. And this is a view of what was being discussed about the creation of what is now Northumberland Avenue, which connects the then recently created embankment, Charing Cross station, to Charing Cross itself, and of course it goes in the middle of the last of those palaces. Northumberland House, former Northampton House, built in the early 17th century. This is a battle that went on for about 25 years. The third Earl of Northumberland eventually gave in because the alternative of having a road that somehow bypassed the garden without touching the house really wasn't acceptable. So the whole thing went. This is one of the last photographs. Indeed, this is the only palace that is photographed because none of the others reached the age of photography. During the 3 days of sale on site of various parts, you can see all the bits numbered, lot such and such, and you can see people going round, and indeed people on the top, and looking at windows, purchasing anything that was being sold, and bits of it are around London. So the Strand for me has always meant some 7 to 8 century of history, and I thought I knew enough about it, as I never particularly questioned what had happened before my period. And actually, why I wouldn't do so actually baffles me now. So reading this book has been like filling holes in a jigsaw one did not even know about, with a number of, I see, kind of moments which have been revelatory to me. In fact, the more I read this biography, and I should also say here that biographies are probably my favorite genre. I'm primarily interested in people and their stories before I even begin to think about buildings. And so biographies of places, which in a way they're different, but they are both possibly the same thing, for it is ultimately people that define places, or is it? In fact, what defines what is another interesting point that this book deals with. The more I read this biography, the more I found interesting hints as to why the Strand became not only what it became, and the book tells you all about it, which you're going to read, but indeed the focus of my own attention. Insofar as what I would say, before dwelling on the whole history of the area, my link with it would have been by topic. That is, as Kyle said, domestic or secular architecture, palaces to be precise, the early modern period, but not only, as I have explored that topic as I moved across Europe, from Italy, via France, and eventually Britain, with a focus on great capital, Rome, Paris, and London in particular. You can see on the top left, Canovetto's Northumberland House, and on top right, Piranesi's Palazzo Mancini. This is, of course, the end of the Strand, and this is the end of the Via del Corso in Rome, and I wrote books about both arteries. Now, I'll return on the similarities and differences here as pertinent to, and indeed also touched upon by this book when it comes to different cities and different thoroughfares. Now, that was before. The after, as I found myself either thinking about or in some cases discovering, by putting bits together, as it were, often unexpectedly as a result of this biography, is more complicated and more interesting, certainly to me, than that. The first point that caught my attention here relates to the physical, the characteristics of the area and consequently the anthropological aspects of it. The Strand as a place in between. This is a late 16th century map which shows the City of London, the City of Westminster, and of course the Strand that connects the two. A place in between. A place for foreigners. Those who are, and I quote here from the dictionary definition, strange or unfamiliar, or from outside. That's exactly what the word means, outside. Foreigners. Those by implication that cannot be quite defined. Those perhaps, like myself. Not that I pretend here to be undefinable in any esoteric terms than someone who's lived and worked in between places and culture, which in the long term triggers all sorts of questions of identity, especially within a country where this is often headline, whereby the meaning of outsider is regularly scrutinized. Interestingly enough, the word foreign assumes its current spelling by association with the word sovereign. Second point discussed in the book is intrinsically linked to what I just said. In fact, perhaps I should have mentioned first, and that is the geological. Strand, or East Anglia area, which once upon a time could have been the setting for a novel perhaps by the likes of Rudyard Kipling, so much it was like, and I quote, tropical Africa translated to an English country park. Of course, Kipling was thinking about a jungle in India, but you get what I mean. So what's not to like here, and what wouldn't attract a Mediterranean like me or so many others? Now, this might be a little fanciful, but we need not go very far to consider how other Mediterraneans, like Canaletto, for instance, had transformed, maybe by way of seeing through the surface as artists do, the way we look at London, perhaps imagining a somewhat tropical past, or less northerner at any rate, that would make that city a direct comparable to its own Venice. Of course, Canaletto is not the only one that applied a foreign narrative of representation in order to draw parallels, or at times, indeed oftentimes, elevate a place to heights unseen. Artistic heights, that is. But whether or not he entertained the same speculative thinking that I'm entertaining here, it certainly would have picked up on the similarity between Venice and London when it comes to their strong riverine environment. Stronger, in fact, than I had thought, even if I had spent some time actually thinking about it, as you can see in one of my other books, until I read this book, this biography. An environment that determined the fortunes of both places, and perhaps fairly uniquely in amongst great cities and their relationship with water. London, the Strand, not without water. As a trained architect and historian, I'm interested in meanings and associations, hidden pieces of a story that link places to people, when superficially there may be none. And this book is full of surprises that make the Strand an all-world stage. My journey through great European capitals goes through different versions of the Strand, understood generally here as a thoroughfare. And on this, in fact, I thought long and hard as I dedicated an entire lecture series a couple of years ago for a course I gave in Rome entitled La Spiaggia e il Corso, and that is the Strand in London and the Via del Corso in Rome, as part of a bigger project on great urban thoroughfares in early modern cities. In my own book on the great houses in London, I refer to the Strand as London's Golden Mile. As a mile it almost was, and it certainly was golden as the centre, absolute centre of conspicuous consumption, where in fact, the apogee, if you like, of material culture comes to the fore. As any relatively long and relatively straight road, the Strand as a thoroughfare is primarily a link between two cities, the city of London and Westminster, as we saw, and here you see a kind of zoomed-in version of it. It is therefore a place of passage to go or move through, to move along, an artery of the heart, hence not a gathering space for any length of time. A neighbourhood perhaps, but even then, both the boundary and more to the point, the elevation, facade, palimpsest of such neighbourhood, a place to be observed from afar, at a distance, from the wide perspective of the Thames. And that's of course how it is mostly captured in the iconic views, such as here in the bottom, a late Wenzel-Holler view that shows the houses, some of them already gone by the late 17th century, of course seen from the other side of the river, and only in exceptional views, such as those two of the banqueting house at York House, towards the western end of the Strand. In fact, this is York House. That's the Watergate, and that's the Watergate there. For those familiar, that's Westminster and Inigo Jones's banqueting hall down there. Only in exceptional views does one see the perspective from a different angle. And it is, of course, a kind of specific one because the whole area is very curvy. In fact, it is a place difficult to capture geographically as one entity, and perhaps, like any riverine environment, a place in flux. As this biography illustrates, and the reader never settles in this respect, it is a place about constant change, more than it is about anything durable, both physically speaking and indeed in terms of the predominance of a given phase and its different characteristics. This, to my mind, has something to do with what one could describe as a known place, where the definition of place is, of course, to do with an image or an idea associated to it, and yet here it constantly changes. Now, the way one understands this definition relates to one's cultural background, and I think more specifically to where one grows up during formative years. And I grew up in Rome. Here you see the beautiful Nolly map of it, which in many ways represent this growing up in that city the way I understand certain notions of space. Rome, as you know, is a city surrounded by walls, with a clear identification of what and who is in, and what and who is out. In fact, the Rome within, in the way boroughs are identified there, is called Roma Uno, which literally means Rome, the first Rome, or Rome one. And that by association is still used to define a certain kind of demographic, alongside a sense of continuity, which Rome quintessentially and magnificently embodies. Yet that continuity, as one, or stasis, as one might say, which is perhaps linked to another stage of one's life, to do with adulthood, can be equally suffocating, restrictive, and to move away from. Hence my own perambulations, which would eventually bring me to the shore of the Strand as a place of inquiry. Now, but the great Strand houses and the bishops' inns before them should establish themselves in an area in between, extra-mania, extra-territorial, free from boundaries, not just physical in terms of space, but in terms of expression and trend setting, is telling enough. And I think well picked up by this biography here, of course, is Holler's view of so-called Covent Garden area that shows from east to west, where it cuts sort of two-thirds down, all of the great houses at a time were really the most splendid time. You can see one after the other. Most of them, 9 out of 11, facing the river, and 2 of them, Bedford House and Exeter or Burley, on the northern side. After all, as I've argued in my own book and elsewhere, what I describe as a truly English style, and by that I mean that, yes, I mean the likes of Wollaston Hall, extraordinarily beautiful, I think, built on the design of Robert Smithson, who is another such great figure that we are studying in this project at the Soane, the Smithson's collection alongside the Thorpe collection. So a truly English style is forged within the Strand, absolutely. That style is nothing but a mixture of foreign characteristics applied onto an established building forms, then to, in fact, borrowed and reinterpreted. A truly English style developed as a key, perhaps the key revolutionary moment in British history, and that is the separation from the Church of Rome, at the dawn what will become, consequently, global Britain, with the implication that all this has on Englishness more generally. An Englishness developed by strangers in an area in between, in an outsider's space. Similar characteristics insofar as the making of cultures are concerned are in fact to be found in other great thoroughfares across the world. But back to the comparison between the Strand in London and the Corso in Rome, both, and so you see here on the left a map that shows you the Via Lata, or the large street, as it was the longest and largest and straightest in the whole of Rome, and here, turned 90 degrees, a view of the Strand there. So you've got the Thames here and the Tiber there. Gates on either side, and here, of course, there would have been Temple Bar, and then further down onto Westminster. So back to this comparison, both are places of passage, of entrance to key areas, to and from walls, and of parade. Yet the Strand is eccentric, as it moves away from established centres and projects its view outward, to the river, in spite of some notable exceptions, like Somerset House, and its remarkable Augustan loggia-type facade, overlooking the street, not the river. This is, in fact, a complete exception, whereby Seymour, who was the king de facto, not very long, but not important nonetheless, built up this palimpsest as a grand loggia for him to address the people, and of course this would have been over the parade along the Strand, so this is perhaps the only urban facade and the whole of the Strand, insofar as the great Strand houses are concerned. The Via del Corso, on the other hand, is concentric and quintessentially urban, unlike its counterpart across the Channel, which play with the notion of, in a way, remains rus in urbe, country in town. And you can see here another view that shows three great houses, Essex House, Arundel House, and a bit of Somerset House. And you can see the enormous site and the large garden. All of these are riverine, rus in urbe kind of palaces to be approached, seen, and appreciated from the river. In fact, the view from the Strand is non-existent, because this would have been completely hidden by the so-called rents or tenements that each belonged to each of the estates, which meant a lot of money, and nobody wanted to be without, except Seymour at Somerset House with this extraordinary facade, which is in fact not that large nonetheless. Still, the same width of the current Somerset House is the same. The Strand biography is very effective in disentangling this element of being and negotiating the in-between, and in explaining, at least to me, why, in spite of all of its very long history, which is summarized, brilliantly summarized, I must say, and brought together in both an enjoyable and accessible way to the reader, the Strand has never really settled on becoming anything other than in between. This, I think, is both its greater asset from an anthropological perspective, because the greatest concentration of the largesse, as somebody else calls it, of the early modern elite, the greatest concentration of artists and thinkers and scientists, was concentrated absolutely there in the Strand. So that sort of otherness and in-between is one of its greatest assets, but also it's the biggest challenge when it comes to what you might say an archaeological, architectural, urban, or perhaps overall what I could call cosmetic point of view. So I'd like to conclude here with an invitation from me to those involved with the latest makeover of the area, following the success of what's been done at Aldwych, to take the next challenge of the overall regeneration of the Strand head on. This biography warrants the Strand all the respect and attention it deserves. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Manolo. And well, this book is very much a biography, and as all of us will know, any good biography doesn't just tell you about the things that happened in a person's past. It also gives you a few juicy tidbits about what's going on behind closed doors during the present, and speculates a bit on what that might pan out like in the future. And that takes us to our second speaker tonight, who is Chanin Babington, who is currently the priest in charge of St Mary the Strand. The church was currently undergoing a huge renovation and reinterpretation project as part of those renovations going on around that area in front of Somerset House. So Chanin Babington was appointed priest in charge of St Mary the Strand in 2020 to lead that restoration and development project, which aims to save the heritage of the church and give it a new role, purpose and life at the heart of the Strand Aldwych area. Before moving to London to take up his role, he was vicar of Bourneville in Birmingham, which I always think gives rise to this wonderful idea of a congregation full of Oompa Loompas going down to the chocolate factory. But he was vicar of Bourneville in Birmingham for 18 years, and his academic research is mainly in the area of practical theology. And with that, I'll hand you over to Canon Peter, who will tell you something about St Mary the Strand.
Thank you very much. Well, it's lovely to be with you. Thank you for inviting me. This could have been a much longer talk, but I'm focusing on the building. I always like to say it's not really what we're doing. It is about a beautiful 18th century building, but it's also about the people and communities around it. But you've got the bit that's more about the building. The Jewel in the Strand, we call is the name for the restoration project, but there's the church. And it's a sort of landmark heritage view of London in a way, looking down the Strand to see St Mary the Strand. If I press this button, will it move on? There we are. Now, it's famously known as St Mary in the Way. This was a nickname given by bus drivers and taxi drivers, but this is a copy of a famous cartoon from Private Eye. I forgot to check the exact date, so I've just guessed it's 1985, I think. And there's the church, surrounded by buses and taxis. It was also known as an island church, but we were an island in a sea of traffic, which has given way, and we are now St Mary in the middle. And that's one of the architect's drawings based on the photograph. So my role is to lead this major restoration and development project for St Mary the Strand, which nearly closed in 2016 to 2018. It was under threat of closure. Fortunately, that attempt was foiled, and although the very few people who were there sort of basically left in protest. But the pedestrianisation of the Strand Aldwych scheme, which is sort of this is the artist's sort of photographic visualisation of that from that project has now been realised. And you can see how St Mary the Strand is really St Mary in the middle of this extraordinary Strand Aldwych scheme with the whole sort of Bush House complex to the north, and then Somerset House and King's and 180 Strand to the south. And so very much geographically in the middle of all this. And that's a photograph that was taken since the pedestrianisation, but you get a sense of the spire just peaking above the top of the large buildings that surround it, and then you can see all the other tall buildings in the distance, like even a bit of the Shard. One of the things that makes St Mary the Strand important in terms of location is that Strand as the road along the shore, joining together the City of London and the City of Westminster. It is the royal processional route, and in a way that's one of the things that shapes its identity. So why is it in need of restoration and development? I mean, I've got this extraordinary job of sort of restarting the church. It's not starting from scratch, but with a 300-year-old Grade 1 listed building in the middle of this amazing conservation area. It's an amazing building in an amazing location, surrounded by extraordinary institutions, and it has several problems. One is access. We have this very beautiful entrance, 9 steps up to the portico, and one of the challenges is how to get people in to this amazing building. It's much easier since you don't have to risk your life crossing the take your life in your hands crossing the traffic, but we still have to then come up these steps. You come into this beautiful space, and that's the view from the gallery. But it's rather fixed and inflexible, and this picture shows how you've got this rather odd blend of the Georgian original and then the Victorian reordering that happened 150 years ago. One of the challenges is about conservation and sort of restoration and repair. This is damage done by water ingress from the rather unusual Georgian rainwater system, which I won't go into tonight. This is the amazing plaster ceiling created by John Chrysostom Wilkins 300 years ago. Indeed, and how to conserve that is quite a challenge. And then we have the stonework on the outside. This is part of the balustrade, and this photograph shows how the bottles of the balustrade are not only rather weathered, but not pinned in to the bit on the top, which has led to us to have to do, like, if you look up from the ground, you can see how we've netted and stabilised the balustrade. That's just a bit of holding work to stop it falling over. We've removed 6 of the urns just to stop them falling off. You can see how the bases were splitting. I'm not going to go into the details. Here was you get a nice view of Somerset House in the distance to locate it, but so you can see how some of the Portland stone there was fractured, and here's one of the stonemasons, and he just lifted it off with his hands. No tools needed. There's one of the beautiful capitals. Again, that piece was lifted off without any tools, and there it's on the ground. Fortunately, none of this stuff actually did fall off on people, so we're very grateful for that. But it was in rather worse state than we thought when I took over. This is another bit. You can just see large lumps of stone have been removed, and you can see part of the problem here is that behind the stonework are iron clamps, and if you get any water ingress, then the iron rusts, and when iron rusts, it expands, and then you get fractures in the stonework. That's called rust jacking, and like many buildings from 300 years ago, St Mary in the Strand has this problem. This is a nice close-up when we were up on the sort of cherry picker high up, and you can see how the beautiful detailing with the carving from 300 years ago, but all these fractures that have appeared, and we've done a lot of pinning and stabilising of this stonework just to hold it all together until we fix it properly. Inside, well, basically the big space, what you see is what you get. We have tiny little ancillary spaces. That's my vestry on the left. There's just about room to swing a cat, but not much more. There's one of the finest loos in London, if you ever want to pop in. That's in the middle there. It wasn't built as a toilet, but we adapted it about 20 years ago. And then a tiny little kitchen at the back of church on the left. So we don't have any ancillary space or useful functioning spaces. Underneath the church there are 3 barrel vaults. As you can see, the remains of old plastic chairs and bits of wood are stored there. The mortal remains of many vacuum cleaners are also interred, along with about 110 lead coffins in the north vault, which had been interred in the vaults on the south side of the church, and when the Strand was widened, there was a compulsory purchase order, and that little bit of churchyard was taken over to make another lane of traffic, and the bodies are in the north vault. I'm not going to show you a picture of that, but I will show you the boiler, which dates from the year of the Great Exhibition, 1851, modernised 60 years ago to run on oil instead of coal or coke, and still working just about. St Mary Strand is either sort of unpleasantly chilly in winter or pleasantly chilly in the summer. At the moment we're in the slightly more pleasantly chilly summer phase. And I could show you a graph of the sort of carbon footprint, but I'm not going to. But that, you know, one of the challenges we face is how to make the building sort of sustainable and usable. So here is the sort of proposed view, and the kind of, so what we're trying to do, we're trying to make the building accessible. We've got to save the physical structure of the stonework, conserve the interior and make it usable, and then create some kind of ancillary space, community space and useful spaces. And the solution that we've come up with is the proposal, which has just been granted planning permission, is to add a sort of terrace onto the north side. So you can see we've sort of effectively pulled out a drawer at the plinth level to create a terrace which will be accessed by a ramp going up on the north. The challenge is to create a ramp that's sort of, in the 1 in 20 gradient that's required. It requires a very long ramp. As you can see, it sort of starts roughly where the gates are now and goes halfway down the church. But you go up that ramp, you go onto a north terrace, you can double back on yourself, you'll come onto the portico and come in the front door. So everyone comes in the same way. So it's step-free, equal access. But the challenge is not just about getting people into the building, you have to get people out of the building. So that terrace allows for an egress on the sort of north-east corner. We're going to give up one of the little sacristy spaces to allow a way through onto the terrace so people can get out safely. And then there's been a ramp down on the south side, which I'll tell you about in a moment. So that's the access. Now the interior, that was the view from the gallery. What we're trying to do is make the space more usable and flexible and probably a bit more coherent. So it's a new layout, but we're referencing the Gibbs original. James Gibbs was the architect. And so we talk about the spirit of Gibbs. It's not a restoration as such, it's a new version, but what we're reinstating is the Portland stone floor with black cabochon, stripping off the Victorian black varnish to reveal the beautiful reddish Baltic oak underneath. We are going to make the pews slightly shorter and movable. The original pews were box pews, which were against the edge. The Victorians remade them into bench pews, and we're going to remake them again. And then the colour scheme is going back to what we think is close to the original, but again, it's not a trying to replicate what was done originally, because we've done paintwork analysis. But Gibbs' instruction was white with colour, which we feel gives us quite a lot of room for manoeuvre. So you can see we've picked up a sort of creamy colour and a white, and the blue is the blue that Gibbs used at the chapel at Wimpole Hall in Cambridge, which is a bit like a mini St Mary le Strand. We expand slightly. We're going to have to do a little bit of reworking of the landscaping to the north of the church, which is part of the Strand Aldrich scheme. It was we have to allow that emergency access road which curves round to the north. You'll see how we have to trim off some of the flower beds. The soft landscaping was supposed to be sort of temporary as part of the meanwhile scheme, as they called it for the Strand Aldrich. People have become very, very precious about these temporary flower beds, but we've been allowed to remodel a couple of them. Now, what I'm showing you now is these are the sort of visualizations that the architects have done. So they're based on photographs, and then with computers they're drawn over them to show what it will look like. So the picture on the left is the view now, and the picture on the right is how it will be after the restoration. I could ask you to spot the difference, but hopefully you'll think, oh, that doesn't look very different. You can just see how basically the gates have moved slightly to the west, and then there's a sort of the plinth wall and railings are sort of slightly more visible. What I'm going to show you now is the views as you go around to the north. Now, we've had to remove in the visualisation the vegetation, the plant, the soft landscaping, the planting, because if we showed that, then you wouldn't see the change. So this is the view of the terrace. So on the left-hand side, you've got the as it is now with the sanctuary garden, and then that's the terrace sort of coming out from the north side. And there will be planting in front of it when it's done. It's just if we'd shown the planting, you wouldn't have seen the terrace. That's the view from side on. It's in Portland stone, and our architects describe it as well-mannered, which I quite like. That's the view from the north-east, and you can see how you have that little bit of egress, the emergency egress coming out of the vestry, the sacristy door on that corner. And then it's the view from the southeast. And again, there will be planting, so don't be worried about the lack of greenery. That will be hiding. But you can see that one of the things we're doing is reinstating the plinth wall and railing on that south side. At the moment, though, you can't see that. There isn't. That was lost when the Strand was widened. But it was never intended to be seen as it is now. That's the view from the south, as you were coming out of King's. And this is an old etching showing that sort of churchyard with the wall and railings and how it goes round on that south side. So we're kind of reinstating that little bit of churchyard. Those are the 3 barrel vaults under the church with that lovely boiler. And there's a way in on the south side. And then with the new scheme, you have the ramp that comes down on the south. And then you come in, we're knocking through the vaults, the barrel vaults, the tunnels, to create a community space. And then the great thing about having a terrace on the north side as the solution for the access is that you can get rooms underneath the terrace. So there's a plant room, accessible loos, and a changing places facility, and a little bit of storage. That's a sort of visualisation of what the community space might look like, which I think we need to have a better picture than that, but then that's what it is for now. Just retaining a memory of the vaults at the far end. And there is St Mary's in the middle. So it was much more about the building than about the people in the communities, because that would be another talk. But that's what we're doing, and it's all about saving the heritage, saving the building, but making it accessible and usable so that it can serve the community. It is the parish church for the Strand. It's an unusual parish. Church of England churches are there for the parish, not for the congregation, for the parish. But it's a rather unusual parish because it doesn't have many residents. It does have some, probably an increasing number. But there's probably about 400 people live in the parish at the moment, according to the last census. But 500,000 people walk past the church every month. There are 40,000 students studying in the parish during term time in 4 different amazing internationally renowned institutions. And there's office workers and tourists. It's the gateway to the West End. The vision from Westminster for the Strand-Aldwych scheme is that it become this slightly grandiosely called a global cultural thinking quarter for the city of Westminster. And but actually it makes sense. There are these academic institutions like the Courtauld, like King's College London, London School of Economics, and now New York University in the parish. There are the Royal Courts of Justice. There's Somerset House, which is the largest sort of cultural hub of its kind in Europe. There's 180 Strand, which is like the young, trendy version of Somerset House as well. And then there's all these West End theatres. It's an extraordinary parish to serve. And hopefully, with the Jewel in the Strand project, St Mary of the Strand will have that role, purpose and life at the heart of the Strand-Aldwych. So, do come and see it if you haven't seen it before. Thank you.
Well, Thank you, Peter, and thank you indeed, Manolo. So having had that kind of story of the past of the Strand, bolstered by this consideration of what's going on at the minute, sort of tantalising view of what might come in the future, it's time to bridge those two with the book itself. So at this point, I'd actually like to invite our two speakers and also our two authors to come to the front and to have a sort of informal discussion about the sort of themes and contents of the book, which will then open up to general questions from the floor as well at the end. But just to introduce our two authors, for any of you who don't know, Eileen Chanin is a researcher in the Humanities Research Centre of the Australian National University in Canberra and a research associate of ANU's Australian Studies Institute. She's also been a senior visiting fellow at King's College London, obviously on the Strand. Her research takes a wide-ranging view of history and its narration, and she's published various books, including Capital Designs, Australia House and Visions of an Imperial London, published in 2018, and the wonderfully named Degenerates and Perverts, the 1939 Melbourne Herald Exhibition of French and British Contemporary Art, which was published in 2005. Geoff Browell then has worked with archives for more than 30 years as a professional archivist and is currently in charge of promotion of King's College London's unique heritage collections. He also runs AIM 25, a charitable consortium of 150 of the archives of London's leading educational organisations, including universities, learned societies, museums and galleries. So I welcome our authors to the front, and I say we'll kick off with a sort of informal conversation. And just to kick matters off, one question that kind of came to my mind, this is very much a biography, and it's unusual for me as an architectural historian to say this at a book launch, but it really is a sort of rip-roaring read through 1,000 years of history. So the first question I'd kind of like to throw out there is, why did you decide on that biographical kind of methodology for thinking about the Strand? What first brought you to think about writing a biography?
Well, it was pretty clear from the start. Can you hear? Is that working? It was pretty clear from the start, because in 1,000 years there has been so much life on the Strand. I mean, when you think about it, anybody who was anybody was on the Strand at any point of time. And fundamentally, we couldn't write about the place without writing about the life that was on it. And when we thought about it, we realized that one of the questions we were asking ourselves was, we wanted to write about the place, but we also wanted to understand how the place and the people who were part of the life on it affected each other, so that we could understand the place. So biography seemed to be the best way of doing it.
Yes, we wanted to avoid the tradition of books that is a compilation of eccentric characters and eccentric people. I love those books, actually. We didn't want this one to be. We wanted to trace its origins from, well, ice ages long ago to the far future, because we recognise that one of the reasons why the Strand is what it is because of its underlying geology, and that meant taking the story back into prehistory.
And that was something that kind of again occurred to me. You kind of kick off the book, as I said, you start off on the first page with going back 1,000,000 years, which is a very ambitious start to any book, but it really kicks off with a consideration of the sort of the Roman building of the Strand. And I found that section, that first chapter, really, really interesting, because I hadn't really thought in terms of anything being there. We always kind of think that after the Roman city of London kind of declines, that nothing is happening in that area at all. You're right into the countryside, but I think you find something quite different there.
Yes, I mean, one of my favourite visions is to imagine the Anglian glaciation, which happened about 500,000 years ago, and it would have been possible potentially to have seen the wall of ice from the Strand, and it extended as far down as Freud's house, if you know where that is, up in Finchley Road. Freud wasn't there at the time. And it's gone through all these amazing changes. The river was far wider, it was a bit like the Ganges at the time. And I didn't include aspects of this in the book because we didn't have space. But of course, the Channel River, which existed at one time before the English Channel was created, this would have all been part of the history of the Strand. extraordinary sort of geological changes. On the Roman side, yes, because one doesn't really think of Fleet Street and the Strand as one thoroughfare as being Roman, but they are. And one of the questions that we wanted to ask was, why was the Roman road built there? Because the main Roman road, of course, is to the north. It's what became Oxford Street. So where was it going? That is an unanswered question. And because the Romans wouldn't have expended resources on building a road that was going nowhere. So where was it going to? And of course, there may well have been a crossing over the river at Westminster. We're not sure. The jury's out on that one. But the river, where Thorney Island, that area around Palace of Westminster and the Houses of Parliament, so that it was possible to ford the river at that point. And the intersection point between that and the Strand lies below Buckingham Palace Gardens. So for anyone who knows the King, my appeal to you tonight is, can you give consent for an archaeological dig in Buckingham Palace Gardens to find out what's there? Now, of course, the Mall came much, much later, very recent history. But actually, I suspect that the Strand, originally as a Roman road, would have followed the line of the Mall, perhaps leading to villas that were in the vicinity of Chelsea and around that area that have yet to be excavated.
I find that aspect of the book really fascinating, that you did do that sort of very early history. I think one of the sort of banes of poor Peter's life is the sort of archaeological evidence that he's finding that the Strand has been active for a very, very long time. So every time they kind of sink a hole to build something, they find something else from the Anglo-Saxon period that needs to be salvaged. So it's really interesting seeing that kind of layered history layered up. But I suppose something else that interests me, and particularly in my area of architecture, is the kind of when the Strand comes into its own in the 18th century, and I think this kind of applies to all of you. It becomes a kind of centre of international encounter, which Manolo was touched on. And when you see all of these things coming together, all of these artistic, cultural, commercial ideas coming together, they really do kind of back up a lot of what's going on in the British Imperial project as well. And I wonder if you wanted to talk a bit about the sort of the Strand as this kind of centre for international contact, and also a centre which sent stuff out, not just sent out these ideas, not just within London and Britain, but right across the world.
Well, I think perhaps we should ask Manolo to talk about that, maybe, if you'd like to, because it actually began long before the 18th century. If I could also just preface by just getting back to the first question, we were conscious that this was the first book to be written on the Strand for well over a century. And when Beresford Chancellor, was it Beresford Chancellor? Yes, wrote really a slim volume of chapters that didn't really tell you, or anyone who did not know London or the Strand, what its complexity was. And so that was why it was imperative that we explained its physical nature right from the very beginning, because the logical thing is to think of the Strand as a course along the river. But in fact, there are elevations, as you know, if you've walked up and down alongside the Strand, and those elevations are variable. They can be as much as 30 feet. And so we felt that we had to explain this so that in the course of telling the story as it unfolded over centuries, everything that happened would be more understandable, because otherwise it wouldn't, you couldn't conceive of the space. So we had to establish the template of the space, as it were, in a reader's mind from the very beginning. And then from there, we kept to a chronological frame in the book, because, well, how else do we tell a life story? And so maybe if I could just now ask Manolo if he'd like to say something about the richness of life that existed there before the 18th century.
Yes, as you were saying, the story begins much, much earlier, and it is somewhat, it begins in earnest when the great bishoprics, the great bishops occupy the area as early as the 13th century. It sort of goes up and down, the amount of things happening there, but this big bishops' inns really were the center of anything you could imagine. Diplomacy, culture, all kinds of activities. And of course there were some bishops' inns within the city, yes, but the majority, because there had to be self-sustained estates, they needed land, and so you needed a space. And then the story continues. Change of power, these properties are exchanged, not confiscated, exchanged. In fact, in some instances, the property was still the church's much, much later than these palaces had changed completely their own destination. And so the story begins much earlier, but as soon as this concept of conspicuous consumption, architectural, artistic, conspicuous consumption, material culture becomes really the language. The Strand is absolutely at the center of it, and it is what sets things. Whether it is the architectural styles, whether it is the way you behave, whether it is the way you live in these great houses. The so-called secularization of liturgy, which takes place in York House with the particular figure whose role it was, the name now escapes me, to essentially borrow from from liturgy, from church liturgy, as to how you would behave, how you would receive, how you would dine, etc., etc., which is really the pattern of state and the notion of the state departments. You see, and so it goes on. So then you have all kinds of people coming in the train of great figures such as Lord Arundel, Benzel Holler, all kind of, Inigo Jones, that becomes Inigo Jones through his patronage, Gentileschi, Rubens, Van Dyck, you name it. So the fact, as I was trying to explain in my own reflections, that the place is neither one thing nor the other, has given it that freedom to experiment and to set trends. The fashion, which of course means what is modern. Modern means fashionable. And so the Strand has been for centuries, quintessentially leading it. Personally, I think that has been a little bit left behind over the last few decades, if not more. And because it's neither one thing nor the other. And if it can become the lead for regenerating and the way we experience cities, I think that would be very nice.
Absolutely. And yes, Peter, I think, yeah.
I think that sense in which it has for centuries been that intersection point for for political power and commercial power and creative and cultural power. I mean, in a way, it's the precedent for this global cultural thinking quarter for the city of Westminster. That's trying to be recreated now. In a way, that current idea of regeneration is really a kind of trying to reclaim some of that history, make it vibrant and living now. So,
and of course, so we were conscious of the rivulets and streams that were left over from the geological shifts that Geoffrey was talking about. And these rivulets and streams can be seen in some of the early maps, but then gradually they disappear. But they would have been perfect conduits for opportunities for reinvention. You could slip in and out of the place, unseen, unknown, and then reinvent yourself. And certainly in the 18th century, it became very much a place to which people migrated from all counties, all parts of England. They came, some seeking to improve their fortunes, others just literally out of curiosity and finding that the Strand was not quite as easy to live on as they had hoped, and so then moving perhaps back or elsewhere, who knows. So by the 18th century, you had you had this incredible life where London had grown following unification of Scotland and England in 1707, and London became the capital in Europe with the greatest number of highest population, and it was a free trade zone to which everyone who wished to could come, while in Europe it was riven by religious wars and persecution. And so this was going on. And again, there's another element to this which gets back to the churches and its location, and that is the tension that exists, if you like, between the city on the one hand and Westminster on the other. So you've got courtly and political power, and you've got the guilds and the merchants, commercial interests, and the gate that stood, that was maintained by the City of London, was there as much as anything for the good burghers of the guilds and the merchants who wanted to, not lose the hold that they had over the artisans who, they wished to, who were apprenticed to the guilds and who they wished to exert their control over. And yet, through the 18th century, as interest developed in new technologies, interest in mechanics, for example, that saw watchmaking take off, where London became one of the centres, or astronomical instruments were another thing where there were so many foremost makers of these objects. And so it became a place of luxury goods. While at the same time, it was also a place to which, because of the churches that had given succor outside the city, as it were, and outside Westminster to the ill, there were hospices, and so there were the poor, and there was this mix that basically stamped the Strand.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something I really did pick up on in the book. It's a story not just of the kind of, even though they are there, the sort of grand bishops and aristocrats and landowners and industrialists. It's very much the flotsam and jetsam of London life. Everyone comes together on the Strand in a way that I don't think you find in many districts. And I think it probably does come from that idea of it being a place of the other that Manolo's setting out there, but some very interesting stories about the sort of ordinary people of London coming together there. And I wonder if there's any particular stories that stood out to you.
I was going to say, it's a very complex space in terms of the parish boundaries, for a start, very, very complex, and also the jurisdictional boundaries as well, because you have the Duchy of Lancaster, you've got Westminster Abbey, you have the Diocese of London, and you have the different parish boundaries as well, which are all sort of vying for attention, and there are different things happening. The east is very different to the west end. The mid Strand has a different character all its own. And if you walk down the Strand now, there is still hints of the differences between those areas. And it was also a place of diplomatic intrigue as well. So there's a lot of, for example, throughout most of the Reformation period, up until the 18th century, there were very large numbers of Roman Catholics lived off the Strand and in the Strand. And of course the French embassy was based there for a time when embassies were only settled institutions from the sort of mid-16th century, really, as we know them. And originally it was further down towards Bridewell and towards Whitefriars, further east, and then migrated to the west. So there's all this going on there too, and that attracted a large body of people who were from different parts of Europe who wanted to come and work and trade and live and escape to.
Yeah, very much a place of the other, and probably in my own work I've come across quite a bit on the idea of it as a kind of centre of Catholic evangelisation in London, particularly in the 17th century, where it takes on this role as being kind of very much attached to the court of the Queen's consort, and therefore a kind of hotbed of anti-monarchical plotting, which is quite interesting. And I'm not sure if you've come across anything like that as well with the church. Is it a kind of, where does it stand kind of religiously? Is it a church very much like the chapel in Somerset House, which is considered to be something of the other, particularly particularly given the fact that James Gibbs, the architect of the church, is both a Jacobite and a Catholic.
Yes, yeah, that's the. I think it's possible to have that sort of reading of St Mary le Strand, and actually a member of the church has just written a rather sort of popularised version of that. What's the word I'm looking for? Controversial history, shall we say? So James Gibbs was Scottish Roman Catholic, pretty outwardly conformist. He was a Jacobite and possibly also a Freemason, and all those sort of things can be seen in some of the symbols and carved into the building and the way it's created. So if you want, if I can plug another thing, then 10th of June, which is White Rose Day, an important day for Jacobites, there's an event at St Mary le Strand called St Mary le Strand Decoded, where you'll hear Jacobite songs and this history told, more as a show rather than a lecture. But if you want to know more, talk to me afterwards.
And was the religion as practiced there then when the church was first built? I mean, is it seen as being sort of high church, bordering on
it would have been, I mean, it's a rather, I mean, Gibbs's Catholicism comes through in the architecture, and it's sort of very, it's like a little bit of Italy in the middle.
But trained in Rome under Fontana.
And he did, it is. So Gibbs wanted, if you don't know the story, Gibbs wanted to, I mean, born in Aberdeen, Roman Catholic, wanted to be a priest, went to Rome, but fell out with the rector of the Scottish College, who was a rather strict Jesuit, and so he left, and his other great love was architecture. He spent a few years showing, I think, the gentry round on the Grand Tour, and his other, painting and drawing all the buildings. He became apprenticed to Carlos Fontana, the papal architect, and the picture you showed of the Palazzo
Mancini, that's the French Academy, which of course he would have been familiar with.
Yeah,
yes.
and the way the pediments alternate between the curved and the triangular is the side of St Mary le Strand. If you put that picture alongside a picture of the side of St Mary le Strand, you could see where Gibbs got his ideas.
Yes.
But the west front, which I was showing on it, is a copy of the north and south porticos of St Paul's Cathedral.
Yeah.
So he's copying
That's right.
Rennes, copying Rome, and the ceiling, which I showed that picture, that's a blend of two ceilings in Rome, one of which is Santa Maria de Maggiore, with the kind of square coffers. So you can see all of Gibbs' influences, they all get woven together, and yet it's finished under George I, very Protestant. The trouble is, the sad thing about St Mary le Strand is it was completely out of fashion as soon as it was finished. It was commissioned under Queen Anne, who loved that English Baroque, but the letters that you can see the commission writing to Gibbs saying, "Oh, for goodness sake, stop all the decoration," when it's finished, everyone goes, "Oh, it's all a bit elaborate and overly decorated, isn't it?" But now we can appreciate it, but it was sort of out of fashion.
And yet, it became known as the new church, and it was known as the new church for over 100 years or more, because it actually regenerated, or it was seen as a regeneration of an area in the middle of the Strand that had become extremely dilapidated. And so this is another part of the ongoing story of the Strand.
I think that part of the Strand was very much a meeting point in the Middle Ages, because there was a cross there. And then later on, of course, the maypole was situated there, the tallest maypole in the land, which I don't see how it could ever have been used as a maypole. Because how many maypoles does one know that are 100 feet tall? And that's the later, its replacement after the Puritans had destroyed it. And then it was at the base of the maypole that the world's first taxi rank was established. So it very much was a place where people met and congregated, and then there's this tension between that, and that happens along the Strand at various places, and its place is a thoroughfare. So there are processions, the procession route. Of course, in the Middle Ages, the Lord Mayor's Show went along the Strand. The Lord Mayor's Show currently stops in the city, and the last bit of the journey is by boat to Westminster. But in the Middle Ages, actually, it was it went along the Strand, and maybe they could think about reinstating that.
Yes, I have to say, in my own work, the Strand obviously becomes extremely relevant as this kind of nexus for kind of cultural output in the middle of the 18th century, and that I find absolutely fascinating. I really have to say, for a book that has such a long kind of chronological scope, there must be parts of it that perhaps you prefer more than others, and would you like to comment on which is your favourite period? Like this I put out to all of the speakers, your kind of favourite period on the Strand when you think it really was telling us something about London and London's place in the world.
Well, Manolo, would you
Well,
like
I
to
can
start?
begin. Certainly, perhaps because I had myself spent some considerable time from the sort of Middle Ages downwards, my favorite period has to be the beginning and the end. The very beginning, when one really puts things in perspective, millions of years ago it would have been this, and this established what it then becomes. That to me was some kind of revelation, you see. Certainly the sort of introductory and the geological analysis.
So you'd like to be there with the hippopotamus and the...
It seems so far removed, but
Yeah.
actually what happens at that point establishes what happens later.
Yeah, indeed, because the hippopotamuses did not return, but the elephant did. Although they were different elephants.
So
They were smaller elephants when they were on the
So
Strand.
that to me was quite interesting.
Yeah. I find it very difficult to say I have a favourite period unless I say to myself, well, which period would I like to actually put myself into so that I could just be there and hear and smell and see and feel. And I think for myself, as much as I'd like to be there in the Edwardian heyday, I think it's probably the 18th century. Because there were such extraordinary characters, and there was so much change swirling around, and it was so mixed, high and low life living alongside each other. Hogarth pictures it. That I find quite extraordinary in ways that you wouldn't see today. And I'd like to just, be a fly on the wall.
Well, you, of course, were a lot written on the sort of Edwardian heyday as well, which is kind of a forgotten period on the Strand, but there was great buildings were kind of constructed, and really when it was not just the centre of empire, but really the centre of the world at that particular point when Australia House was being built, for instance. So, yeah. But, Geoff,
I could have probably several, if I may, very, very briefly. So, the far distant past, because it's an extraordinary landscape that existed then. And the animals that existed then as well. The pandas, there were pandas on the Strand, yes, yeah. As well as elephants and hippopotamuses, and many other creatures. And then I'd say probably the early modern period, but because I started off as an early modern historian, and so I have a fondness for that period. And then later on, I'd say the era of Charles Wheatstone and telegraphy and electrical experimentation that took place off the Strand. There's a wonderful description of somebody looking in from the Strand at King's College and seeing the electrical. There was something called the George III Museum in King's College, which was the donation by Queen Victoria of George III's collection of scientific instruments, which were pneumatic and electrical. And it was a place of research, so people came and did their research there. It prefigured the Cavendish laboratories by 30 or 40 years. And also a place of spectacle, so the public would come in and look at the experiments of an evening, and they would pay money to do so. And there is a description of somebody looking in and seeing the electrical blue arc light from outside on the Strand looking in. So it's very Frankenstein-like in that sense. I'd say probably the era of radio communications, which really the whole area was a pioneering space for the history of broadcasting. People like Appleton, who discovered the Appleton layer and ionosphere, which permits radio waves to travel across the horizon, and many other pioneers like that. But my favourite would probably be the far future. So I wonder what the place will look like then. And perhaps it will return to forest then, but there will be no one there to see the leaves fall. Perhaps there will be ruins of the buildings that are among the thickets of the hedges, and then just the sound of birds once again.
Yes, and I love that kind of imagination in your final chapter of kind of having to visit some of the ruins of Somerset House as a scuba diver when it's all flooded because of global warming. It's a really interesting idea in itself. But yeah, Peter, as well, you're slightly biased given the date of the church, but when would you most like to have dropped yourself into the past of the Strand?
Well, just an era that hasn't been mentioned tonight, I'm going to put in a vote for, because my own area of interest in terms of history is some of the radical periods of English history and upheaval. And so John of Gaunt's palace of the Savoy, which was probably, he was the richest man in Europe, wasn't he, at the time, one of the most powerful. He was the brother of the king. And it was destroyed in the Peasants' Revolt, or the Great Uprising of 1381. So, all the thing I love about the Strand is there's all this history. As I walk around, you can see, and the reason why that bit is the Duchy of Lancaster there is because it was the parishioners of St Mary of the Strand decided after John of Gaunt had gone that the Savoy should be given to the monarch.
And of course, the Duchy of Lancaster's archive is in Brettenham House, where it was. So walk as if you're going over the Waterloo Bridge, and just the building on your right, and at the very end, facing the river, there's a small door, and that's where the archive lived.
Mm. So if you go to the Royal Chapel of the Savoy, because the monarch is the Duke of Lancaster, the Duchy of Lancaster was given to the monarch after 1381, and when you sing the national anthem at the Chapel of the Savoy, you sing, "God save our gracious King, long live our noble Duke," which will catch you out, I guarantee you.
That's wonderful. And just before I open it to the floor, just to get something kind of topical in here, obviously we've discussed a lot this evening about how the Strand is kind of in a perpetual state of becoming and never really reaching its completed state. Obviously, it's currently under a particular spotlight and being redeveloped at the minute, and I'd just be interested to hear what you thought the future held for the Strand and what you think of what's currently going on with things like the Strand Aldwych development.
Okay, well, first of all, I think we have to be extremely more ambitious. And the Oxford Street idea, the project there, the Aldwych, traffic really has to be a history of yesterday insofar as I see it. And rethink in terms of large scale the whole area. And even if it was made to be pedestrianised, it would be an enormous improvement. Then we can talk about the cosmetics, as I referred, which need attention. But if you think that is an aquatic riverine environment that is sloping down towards the river, the activities and the whole rethinking of the whole area, which is substantial, if you remove traffic and tarmac and you give it to the people, how these people move, I know. It's also a question, but I think we have to absolutely go towards that direction. So I very much hope that the future in the middle term goes in that direction, and that enormous parts of London are reconsidered.
Interesting. Eileen?
I think it's a victim of its own success because it has actually been such a hub, and actually, interestingly, it was one of the latest places to which the trains arrived in London, the trains brought their own problems because they brought an increase in visitation. They brought the day trippers that came to the theatres, which of course made the theatrical West End flourish, which was great for creativity and all that happened there. But look at it today. That Peter's new zone, pedestrianisation, was actually proposed back in the plans that were being mooted with the developments that the London County Council were looking at back at the turn of the century, in around 1900, when they were tasked by Parliament to rectify the problems associated with the Strand. And this had been an argument that had been going on for already in Parliament for some 200 years. Nash had actually tried to fix it, only they'd run out of funds because of the Napoleonic Wars. So it was suspended. But, you know, this argument about what to do about the centre of London, i.e. the Strand, was a perpetual problem that just never got fixed or attended to properly until eventually, at the close of the 19th century, Parliament gave the London County Council the funds to go ahead with the Strand Kingsway improvement, as it was known, the creation of Aldwych and Kingsway, and make the Strand the new centre of central London. And in that proposal, there was the idea that there would be a zone, exactly as you've probably seen it.
No, I haven't seen it.
Well, unfortunately, it became controversial, and so it never actually happened. But yes, there were trees to be planted, and there were to be seating areas. And it's interesting how an idea, was seeded 100 years ago, and finally came to fruition and has been shown to make such a difference, because the area is actually quite small. The length of the Strand is something like 1,200 meters. It's 1,200 feet, 1,200 meters. It's under a mile. It's under a mile. It's very small. Aldwych is not large. I mean, it was grand when it was created. It was London's kind of Haussmann project, if you like. And the French Parisian council members were brought to its opening by King Edward, who was a great Francophile, to show off how London was going to be like Rome, which had undergone modernization at the turn of the century, and Berlin and Paris. European capitals were looking to modernize themselves, make themselves grand, and London needed to do the same. So that's why it has the crescent shape that it has today. But of course, that's, a century ago, and now we have completely different opportunities to refresh what we have been given. We've got this historical treasure, really, in a way, that it's not very vast. It's got gems within it. They all tell stories, and we need to be able to ensure that those stories can continue to live for future generations, so that they can continue to make their own stories in this centre of London.
Geoff, again, throw that one out to you. What does the future hold? Hopefully not a world taken over by artificial intelligence, as you opine. But
will we ever know whether we were artificial intelligence or real? I suppose I'm a convert to the pedestrianisation. I was a bit of a sceptic to begin with, because I thought this is another pedestrianisation scheme, and there have been a lot around London and other cities, and they haven't necessarily worked. I thought with jugglers and mime artists, and you think, oh God, we really need that. But actually it hasn't turned out that way. It's been a tremendous success, and the air is a lot clearer. I think it really is. It was the most polluted part of London. It was the highest rated polluted area in London, and now the figures are heading in the other direction. So that's wonderful, and the whole Strand should be like that, really. But a place of procession again, I think. I think I'd really have that connectivity with Westminster and the city should be re-established, and get people back living in the area as well. Maybe reopen one of those great houses. Perhaps we could re-establish one of them, apart from Somerset House, I mean, and bring back the Gaiety Theatre. That would be wonderful. So I think it just needs a bit of a makeover now, a bit of money spending on it, and get visitors back in it. The West End is neglected around Charing Cross Station, I think, very much so, and really it's a poor relation to Trafalgar Square, and if the two can be connected up in some way, it will turn it into a wonderful piazza.
And finally, Peter, again, you're slightly biased, but
Well, I think cities are for people. That's what I was saying, and I'm a big fan of the sort of human city. And I'd love to see more people living in my parish again. Not just coming to the church, but just living there and enjoying the space.
Fantastic. And with that then, I'll open it to the floor if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask of any of our speakers this evening. Or about the Strand? Oh yes, please go ahead, yeah.
When did the Strand
Hang on.
stop being reached? Sorry, when did the Strand stop being reached?
Well, we want Geoff, I think, yes.
Right. Well, I mean, during Anglo-Saxon times, of course, London was located underneath the Strand and underneath Covent Garden. And it was at that point, the river was much wider. It was much wider before the embankment was built, it was wider still. And the boats used to be dragged up onto the foreshore, probably only about 70 feet away from where the road is now. And there would have been a whole complex of tenements and of jetties and of buildings of one kind, warehouses at the time. And small avenues, a bit like the rows and scores that are in Great Yarmouth and Lowestoft, if you know those. So very, very narrow, so narrow that one person could reach out and touch another person on the other side. And there are photographs from those places of exactly that happening. So my bet, and we don't know for certain, is that it's sometime in probably the 10th century, around that time.
Anyone else like to ask any questions? Oh yes, fantastic.
Listening to the panel, and particularly Peter, and looking at the church, and thinking about the context of all this, why was the church was one of the first that was built, if I'm not correct, not mistaken rather, by an edict of Queen Anne.
Yes.
There must be a story behind why St Mary le Strand was built, erected where it is. What's the story?
Well, so the original St Mary le Strand was roughly where Somerset House is, and it was knocked down by the Duke of Somerset to build his palace. And then he promised to build a new church, but he had his head chopped off before he could do that. So for about 170 years, the parishioners didn't have a church, and then all these other buildings happened. So when Queen Anne brought forward this act, the Act for 50 new churches in 1711, they had to find a new place. And you can see from this picture behind me that at the moment, St Mary le Strand looks like it's sort of on its own, but it was at the end of a row of houses, buildings, and then on the north side is Holywell, which is a tiny little lane. So it wouldn't have looked like it does now, in that sort of sense of like being almost on its own in the middle of this piazza. It was sort of at the end of a row. The Strand was never this wide on the south side either. So, but the important thing is the view from the west. So you see it So Queen Anne loved her processions, a way of showing, just demonstrating her power and her piety. And so it would have been visible, on that royal processional route as you came down. And the west front, just to remember, it looks like St Paul's Cathedral, the north and south porticos. So it's sort of like, I think, this is my view, in terms of London, it's sort of a way marker on the way to St Paul's on this royal processional route.
Sorry, go on.
But where the maypole was, there was going to be a church, but Gibbs actually had the job to build what was going to be a column, which would have been taller than Nelson's column is now, just to give you the scale. Gibbs had designed that. And on top was going to be a statue to Queen Anne. And so Gibbs had got the job of building that, and Thomas Archer had the contract for building the church. Gibbs had laid the foundations and had all the stone delivered, and then Queen Anne died, so the column got cancelled, and somehow Gibbs managed to elbow Archer out of the way and took over building St Mary le Strand according to the design he had, using the stone he had delivered to build the column. And where the sort of urn is on the front above the portico in Gibbs' drawings is a statue of Queen Anne. So it would have been it's a sort of monument and temple on the royal processional route, leading to St Paul's.
I have another theory.
Excellent.
And that is originally, so if you look at the age of the churches and the age of the buildings that preceded the churches along that run, on the extreme east you have St. Bride's, and then on the extreme west you have St. Martin's. And then if you look a few hundred yards further to your east, beyond St. Clement Danes, is St. Dunstan's in the west. Then there's St. Clement Danes, and the original St. Mary's was further this way, here, and another church called the Church of the Holy Innocents, we think. We're not sure exactly where that was. And actually, by building the church here, it makes a straight line between all those churches.
What's also important to notice in terms of provenance, being that Gibbs is a pupil of Carlo Fontana, is the twin churches in the Piazza del Popolo in Rome, which act exactly as the terminus of each of the three roads, exactly as you see it in this picture. In fact, stylistically, there's other resemblances as well. The top of a neighborhood, which is pointed somewhat, which ends up with a terminus church, in the Roman instance, of course, two.
There is another element too that hasn't been discussed, and that is that the Strand was very irregular in its width.
Yeah.
It was not a road that was the same, it was not straight, it was not the same width, and this was supposed to be the widest, it was described as its widest point, its most open space, its premium spot on the Strand, therefore. And so that could also be another reason why. There, right through into the 1920s, you'll see a photograph in the book of how buildings extruded into the Strand and blocked traffic.
Yeah, and people were fined for it, including the big and the greats, for doing it illegally.
It's I think it was referred to earlier, this the Strand Cross might have been there. So one of my worries as we go into the restoration project is going to dig down and discover the foundations of the Strand Cross or something like that, which I'm sure people like Geoff will be immensely excited about. I would be excited about too, but it will sort of delay the project by about 10 years while we do the archaeology.
Yes, well, on that note, Alan, have we any other questions? Or I certainly know this soporific evening, it'll be nice to get a drink, and we can certainly continue the discussion at the reception afterwards, which will be taking place in the Research Forum seminar room, which is just, if you go through these doors and turn right, you'll see us all heading down towards there. You can have a drink and obviously also purchase a copy of the book. But at this point, if I could just say thank you to all four of both our authors and our two speakers tonight for coming along and really giving us a huge insight into this absolutely fascinating history of what truly is, as Disraeli said, one of the great thoroughfares of Europe. So thank you very much to everyone, and thank you indeed for all of you coming this evening as well. Thank you.